Hey, welcome to 12 Tone. This is the story of the most important fire in rock history. In December 1971, at the Montreux Casino in Switzerland, there was a show by Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention. And it was packed. Reports of the crowd size ranged from 2,000 to 4,000 people, but even the low end of that was over capacity for the venue, and the ceiling had been decorated with some sort of bamboo pattern for the end-of-year festivities. What happened next is a bit unclear. The most common version is that as keyboardist Don Preston was taking a solo, someone fired a flare gun, but other witnesses report someone shooting a pistol, throwing lit matches in the air, or that the fire started spontaneously near a ceiling lamp, implying a short circuit. No matter how it started though, the fire quickly spread through the flammable decorations, and once they realized the severity of the situation, the band stopped the show and Zappa directed the audience to head calmly toward the exits. And they did. According to one attendee, the crowd was too stoned to panic, so the evacuation was relatively smooth and orderly, and while they had to break a couple windows to get everyone out, everyone did get out. There were no deaths and very few injuries. But that wasn't the only close call that day. Parked outside the Montreux Casino was the legendary Rolling Stones mobile studio. At that point, the RSM had already been used to record classic albums by the Stones, Led Zeppelin, and The Who, and it was in Montreux being used by Deep Purple. They had planned to record in the casino while it was closed for the winter, but because of the Zappa show, they hadn't yet brought in their gear. Still, the venue had suddenly become unavailable, so with the help of a friend, they relocated to an empty theater called the Pavilion. But as soon as they started playing, neighbors complained about the noise, and pretty soon the police showed up. According to band members, their roadies had to literally block the doors to keep them out just long enough for the band to track one song, but then they were back to searching. Eventually, they found another hotel that was closed for the winter and recorded the rest of the album in a hallway. After such an incredible ordeal, they decided to tell that story through the song they'd recorded in the Pavilion, painting a picture of the fires on the shores of Lake Geneva with the evocatively titled Smoke on the Water. Let's take it apart. The song starts like this. With perhaps the most iconic riff in all of rock music. It's so simple that drummer Ian Pace once said the most amazing thing about it was that somebody hadn't done it before. We'll come back to that. But before we get into the structure of it, and trust me, we will, but first I want to look at some of the details, the things that make Ritchie Blackmore playing this riff sound so much better than that guy you heard that one time at Guitar Center. First off, the line is harmonized in parallel fourths. I think most guitarists know that at this point, but Blackmore once complained in an interview that people keep getting it wrong, so it seemed worth mentioning. These rigid fourths turn the riff from single notes into effectively power chords, which is significant because when you play a chord through heavy distortion, all the existing frequencies interact to create new bonus frequencies in a process called intermodulation. With a power chord, one of the added frequencies is a fairly prominent low root, so when we hear this, there's a noticeable impression of a G 2 octaves below the one he actually played, giving the line a lot more weight than you'd get with a single note. It's also worth considering that this first pair of notes is D and G, which are the open notes on the third and fourth strings of a guitar, but as far as I can tell from live videos, Blackmore never plays them open. He always frets them on lower strings. This might sound subtle, and yeah, it is, but due to their thickness, different guitar strings have slightly different tones, and fretted notes always sound a little different from open ones, so choosing to fret these gives it a darker, more ominous sound. Again, subtle, but there. Then there's his picking technique. These notes aren't strummed, they're plucked simultaneously with two fingers. That gives them a sharper onset, going from silence to sound quicker than you'd get with a pick. But more important than the onset is the release. This is something I don't see talked about much, but at the end of each sustained note, there's this percussive mute sound that comes from him slamming his fretting hand into the strings to silence them. Check it out. This punctuates each line, separating them out and creating clear, unambiguous gaps of silence in between. It may sound like a small thing, but I can actually demonstrate just how important it is thanks to a live performance where Blackmore got a bit sloppy. In the intro, on the second bar of the riff, he does the mute the first time, and you can hear how punchy it sounds as he physically cuts off the end of the note. But the second time through, he doesn't, and I think it sounds a lot weaker. So yeah, if you want to sound like Ritchie Blackmore on this riff, harmonize it in fourths, fret everything, pluck with your fingers, and make sure you mute your strings. Hope that helps. You may have also heard that Blackmore once told an interviewer that he'd based the riff off the opening line of Beethoven's Fifth. Specifically, he said it was an interpretation of an inversion of the theme, although for the music theorists in the audience, it'd be more technically correct to call it an interpretation of a retrograde. And yeah, I can see it. If we ignore this note and play it backwards, it's basically the same melody. But I'm not sure how serious he actually was. I suspect Blackmore was just messing with the interviewer, because there's a much more obvious explanation for where this riff came from. The blues scale. Structurally, the riff is a call and response, or more accurately, a call, call, call and response. Each of the first 3 bars plays the same unstable line, walking up the G blues scale from the root to the 4th, and then he finally answers it by walking back down. But if he stuck to exactly that script, it'd be boring, so to spice it up, he adds another level of call and response, grouping these 2 calls into one big call, and the last 2 bars become a large-scale response to that. He keeps the first bar of each half the same for symmetry, and changes the second bar for more interesting movement. In the first half, he adds a reaching tone, a melodic device where you overshoot your target note and then step back down. Here, the target note is C, and in G blues, the next note up is D flat, so he adds one of those. That cuts off the B flat a little early though, so to compensate, he pushes the first 2 notes forward an eighth, which also creates some syncopation against the rigid quarter note pulse of the first bar. 2 birds, 1 stone. In the second half, he combines the C at the end of the last call with the 1 at the start of the response, and bumps the last 2 notes forward to echo the syncopation from the first half. And yeah, that's it. That's how you write the greatest rock riff of all time. There is, however, another possible explanation. Remember, Pace said it was amazing that no one had done it before, but that's not quite true. Check out the opening to the 1964 song Maria Moita by bossa nova artist Carlos Lira. So, am I saying Blackmore stole the riff from Lira? I don't know, the similarity is there, and bossa nova was pretty popular in the 60s, so it's certainly possible he'd heard it. Makes more sense to me than the Beethoven explanation, but beyond that, I'll let you reach your own conclusions. Still, seemed worth mentioning. The rest of the intro is based on an arranging technique called progressive layering, where you play the same thing over and over but keep adding new parts. It starts with just Blackmore's riff, but after a couple of those they introduce the second layer with 2 new instruments. The first is John Lord doubling the riff, and pop quiz, what instrument is that? If you said guitar, then yeah, that's a pretty good guess, although it is wrong. Lord is playing a Hammond organ here. The reason it sounds so guitar-like, though, is that instead of the standard Leslie speaker that's such an iconic part of the traditional Hammond sound, he ran his organ through a guitar amp, a setup the band often referred to as the Beast. This allowed him to use guitar-like distortion and match Blackmore's tone pretty closely, even on a completely different instrument. But you can still hear some of that Hammond touch at the ends of phrases when he slides off the last note. The other instrument here is Ian Pace's drums with a constant stream of 16th note hi-hats. Blackmore's riff is mostly quarter notes with a little 8th note syncopation, so this introduces a brand new rhythmic layer, creating a denser, more oppressive metric atmosphere. After one more statement of the riff, he brings in a backbeat snare, and slowly we see the groove taking shape. The next layer introduces Roger Glover's bass. You might assume he'd play the riff as well, but instead he hammers out 8th note Gs. Normally, I wouldn't comment on a bass part that just sits on the root, but here I think it's noteworthy because of how it combines with Blackmore's riff, providing a drone against which all the other notes are heard. The slow, steady rhythm of the riff combined with a harmonized fourth imply a chord progression, but Glover comes in to say it's actually just a melody. The C's become even less stable, transformed by the bass into a sort of sus chord, constantly fighting the gravitational pull back down. In the response phrase, though, Glover suddenly breaks from the root, jumping up to the fourth and walking down to a resolution with Blackmore. Or not quite with Blackmore. Glover hangs on the B flat for an extra eighth note, stretching out that root and complicating the sense of closure it's trying to provide. From there we get one more layer, with Pace adding some kicks. This last repetition also speeds up a bit as the band pushes the tempo building up to the verse. Here, Blackmore backs off, switching to simple power chord arpeggios, that give us a clear picture of the harmonic structure of the section. We've got 4-bar phrases mostly sitting on G, with a brief visit to F at the end of bar 3. The F chord provides a little bit of motion, but mostly this is an example of what Dr. Philip Tagg calls one-chord changes. Basically, instead of a long, meandering chord progression, blues-based styles like this will often just sit on one chord for a whole section, creating a rich, complex groove out of supposedly static harmony. Blackmore's part is pretty skeletal, but you can see more of what I mean if we look at Lord. He's clearly jamming on a G minor chord, but he's taking much more advantage of the space provided by that single harmonic location. He's got this rhythmic figure of 2 eighth notes punctuated by a response from his left hand, and then he adds in this little D minor voicing at the end of the first bar, which combined with the G and the bass makes this momentarily a G minor 7 sus2. And I'm not pointing that out to be like, whoa, it's a jazz chord, because it's not. It's a decorative figure and it passes quickly, but the point is he's creating motion within a single chord instead of moving between different chords. In fact, we can view the F chord near the end the same way. If we listen to how Lord plays it, he's using it to move from a G minor voicing with B flat on top to a lower one with G on top. It's a passing chord, another piece of decoration, not an essential component. Even if it does get held long enough to be worth including on chord charts, the actual progression here feels like one long G minor. Throughout the verse, Lord continues to play around with this in different ways, complicating the rhythmic figure, and eventually starting on a higher voicing. And I suspect that if he had recorded it again, he'd wind up doing a lot of things slightly differently. That's the beauty of these one-chord changes. They leave so much room for improvisation and vibe, and Lord is reveling in that space. But there's one dude here that's having even more fun. Glover. He's the driving force behind this whole section, and his part is different every time. Or, I mean, not entirely. There is a clear structure to it. In each 4-bar phrase, he starts by playing octave Gs 3 times, then he takes a 2-beat fill. In the second half, he plays the octave Gs again, then walks down an F power chord, accentuating the new harmony with a change in melodic direction, and then he finally lets loose with a full bar run to the end of the phrase. As far as I can tell, he never repeats a fill, and I'd be shocked to learn that he had any of them planned. Members of Deep Purple have talked about how they never really sat down and wrote songs, they just jammed until they found something they liked, and listening to Lord and Glover play off each other's grooves makes it clear why that approach worked so well. On top of all that is, of course, Ian Gillan's vocals. The phrasing of each line is slightly different, but like Glover, he has a clear guiding structure, which is basically just a walk down the minor pentatonic scale. He alternates between starting lines on high G, we all came out to Montreux, and starting them off on F with a rising accent, to make records with a mobile. And then he sits around the middle of the scale for a bit before wandering down to a low G. On the Lake Geneva shoreline. The third line of each verse provides some contrast by ending on D. We're at the best place around. But the main point I want to highlight is just that throughout the verse he sticks pretty closely to G minor pentatonic, or including the occasional D flats, G blues. Everything is drawn from that, which is why it's so surprising when the chorus starts like this. Smoke! That's an E. He's singing an E. That's not just outside the minor pentatonic scale, it's not even minor. It's the major sixth. What gives? Maybe the harmony can answer this. Blackmore and Glover are no help playing power chords and roots, but Lord does give us a complete chord, and it's C minor with a pretty obvious E flat, which surprisingly enough does give us the answer we were looking for. Singing major thirds over minor chords and vice versa is a pretty classic thing in blues melodies, and if we listen to Gillan and Lord together, you can hear the rich, complex sound it creates, not quite dissonant in the classic sense, but with a sharp, bluesy bite. Gillan also juxtaposes that E with his own E flat later in the line, "Smoke on the wall." But now the harmony vocal is the one being weird, singing a major seventh, or perhaps more accurately, a flat root. Is that just another blues thing? Well, yes, but it's a different one. Let's go back to the chord progression. We start on the 4, end on the 1, and then in the middle we have this seemingly random A-flat chord. Except, again, it's not that random. In a lot of Western music, if we have a 4 and a 1, we'd expect the chord between them to be the 5, in this case D major. But that sounds really classical. To get a bit of a resolution without feeling so dated, it's common for blues songs, especially jazz-influenced ones, to do what's called a tritone substitution, where you swap out the 5 chord for another dominant 7th based on the flat 2. This keeps the same tension since both chords contain the leading tone, but it gives you smoother voice leading with the bass just sliding down a half step to the root. That's what they're doing here, and this G-flat in the harmony vocal is just expanding that dominant 7th sound. But there's another possible analysis of this progression that doesn't feel right to me, but it's too cool to not mention. Remember how Blackmore claimed the riff was based on Beethoven's Fifth? Well, if we take that intro again and skip this note, that's the bass line for the chorus part. Sort of. This last note isn't the root in Beethoven's piece, and obviously it's in a different key, but they're not unrelated. Again, I think the blues explanation makes a lot more sense in terms of stylistic context, but if you actively want to listen for Beethoven in it, you can make that hearing work. I want to go back to Lord's part though, because it's a huge sonic departure. In the verse, he was playing short stabs in the upper register with lots of space in between, but here, he's practically a one-man wall of sound, with thick, sustained chords in the left hand and legato arpeggios in the right. Blackmore is still doing those same power chords, and Glover's part is sparser than the verse, so the explosion of texture that happens as the chorus begins is almost entirely thanks to Lord and his beast. The end of the first phrase features a new riff, played in unison by Glover, Lord, and Gillan, although surprisingly not Blackmore. He just holds octave Gs, but the rest of the band is dancing around the root, bouncing between G and the minor pentatonic notes directly above and below it. Pace also joins the fun, trading on-beat hi-hats and off-beat kicks to mirror the rhythm of the riff. This is a pretty big deal, so when the chorus phrase starts to repeat, you naturally assume they're gonna play it again. Instead, Blackmore catches you off guard by jumping directly into the intro riff, cutting off the chorus mid-sentence. It's a real power move, slamming you in the face with an unexpected early return to that driving intro. The remaining verses and choruses don't really add anything super new, probably because they don't have to. The improvisational approach to accompaniment means that even without introducing new structural components, the natural fluctuation in parts keep each repeat feeling fresh and exciting. But there are 2 more things I need to talk about. First, we've got Blackmore's solo. It's a really expressive piece with lots of bends and vibrato, but the thing that really interests me here is that at the same time, Glover is also taking a solo of his own. It's a very different kind of solo, too. Blackmore has this push-pull rhythm alternating between slower phrases and blisteringly fast runs, but Glover is launching an unyielding eighth-note assault, marching all up and down the pentatonic scale. It's a simpler solo, to be sure, and one could certainly argue it's not really a solo at all, since Blackmore is still the focus. But whether you call it a solo or not, the point is that in both density and range, he's a lot more active here than any other part of the song, giving the impression that he's trying to compete with Blackmore for the spotlight, and he's not the only one either. Pace busts out this 16th note marching snare to further complicate the texture. That chaotic atmosphere does a great job capturing the confusion of the song's eponymous fire. You can feel a rising anxiety that culminates with the return of the riff as Blackmore slowly unbends a string in a sound eerily reminiscent of a passing siren. And then there's the outro. After the final chorus, the song spends almost a full minute looping the riff again, and just like the intro, they're building progressive layers. It picks up where the intro left off with the full band, and then steps things up even further. Pace starts setting up the backbeat snares with an open hi-hat, and Glover jumps back and forth between low and high Gs. Together it sounds like this, and it leads us into our final climactic layer. Here, Pace adds that hi-hat before every beat. Blackmore drops the riff in favor of these metrically displaced pentatonic trills. And Lord just rips out a solo that runs until the song fades out. But it doesn't fade out evenly. To my ears, the drums fade slower, so we're left with this stunning moment at the very end where everyone else is gone and Pace is still just pounding away. Ugh, so good. And that's pretty much it. As a modern metalhead breaking down this song, it's easy to see why Deep Purple are considered such pioneers in the early proto-metal scene. Their techniques are deeply grounded in the blues rock tradition, but through those techniques they were writing the script for generations of future metal acts to follow. There's a heaviness, not just in sound, but in attitude, that runs through this song's veins, and while this version of Deep Purple would break up just a couple years later due to rising tensions between band members, it remains their most iconic lineup to this day, in no small part due to the power of Smoke on the Water. As some of you may know, about a year and a half ago, I made the decision to stop doing sponsorships. I'm not a salesperson, I have no interest in trying to get you to buy someone else's product, and that pressure, combined with the publishing deadlines that come with a sponsorship, meant I wasn't able to focus on making great videos. I just had to get them done so I could sell you something, and that's not good for you, me, or anyone but the sponsor. Taking a break from that has, I believe, allowed me to make some of the best, most detailed, and most interesting videos I've ever made, and I hope you've seen that improvement too. But it does have a downside. Making 12-tone is my full-time job. It has to be. These videos take a really long time to make, and sponsorships were a huge part of how I paid my bills. Cutting them out meant taking a significant pay cut, and YouTube ads are wildly inconsistent at the best of times, so I've had to rely pretty heavily on my Patreon patrons to fill that gap. I really couldn't do this without them. If you like what I do, and especially if you agree that going sponsorless was the right call, I'd like to ask you to join them if you can. There's a link in the description to my Patreon page, and as a thank you, my patrons also get to vote each month on which song I analyze, so if you want to help shape the future of this channel, that's the best way to do it. I really appreciate everyone who helps me afford to keep making these silly little elephant videos, but I do also want to emphasize that when I said if you can, I meant it. I know times are tough for a lot of people right now, and if you're not sure you can afford to support me, please don't. Keeping 12-tone free has always been really important to me, so I'll never hide it behind a paywall or ask you to pay more than you want. But if you can afford to help, and you want to, it would mean a lot to me. Anyway, thanks for watching, thanks to our Patreon patrons for making these videos possible, and extra special thanks to our featured patrons, Susan Jones, Jill Sundgaard, Duck, Howard Levine, Warren Huart, Damien Fuller-Sutherland, and Jon Hancock. If you want to help out, and help us pick the next song we analyze too, there's a link to our Patreon on screen now. Oh, and don't forget to like, share, comment, subscribe, and above all, keep on rockin'.